Week two of early church history, and we'll get off with a kind of a programming note here, I guess. In the first week, I misread the book in terms of how quickly they were presenting information. Basically, each week, according to the book, has three lessons in 1 week. Well, I thought one lesson was 1 week, but no, I shorted you last week. So we're going to take the final two lessons of week one, put it into this week, do all of week two and week three. Anyway, we will catch up at some point in the year. This isn't something you need to worry about. It was just me and a little oversight here. So we're going to have two of the lessons today, and both of them have to do with Paul, who starts off being called Saul. Again, those of you who have paid attention in Sunday school will have a good idea on the story behind this, but it is very significant, and one of the most significant events in early church history. If you were paying attention last week in class, and I hope you were, you know that when Stephen, the martyr, was stoned, the religious officials who took him outside the city to do that, they took off their cloaks and they put them with this young man named Saul, who had already evidently developed quite a reputation as one of these Pharisees that was pretty keen on persecuting Christians. And again, he thought he was doing the right thing. He was a devout Jew, and by his interpretation, what these Christians were doing was blasphemy, claiming that Jesus was the Son of God, was the Messiah. To him, that was blasphemy. So he thought he was 100% in the right, doing wrong. That's a cautionary tale for all of us today. Again, it's very, very easy to be convinced you're the good guy when you're the bad guy. Keep that in mind. We're going to talk about the rest of his life, which is nothing short of amazing. Quite frankly, outside of Jesus, of course, Paul is probably the most interesting person in the Bible. Maybe David is a close second, maybe a tie for first, but Paul certainly the most interesting of the New Testament because he wrote about 2/3 of what we call the New Testament today. Let's consider who Saul was at the beginning. Again, it gets a little confusing because Saul and Paul, we'll get to that in just a second. Again, Saul was a very, very conspicuous enemy to the early Christians. He was one of the men that persecuted them. Quoting Acts 3, "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison." From what we know about Paul, again, a very devout Jew, a Pharisee who is not only a Jew, but one who is ultra observant and very, very much in tune with the law of God, less in tune with the grace of God. Again, as far as he was concerned, everything he did was because of Jewish law. He thought he was the good guy. Matter of fact, in some of his letters later on, he kind of defends his Jewish creds and talks about how he grew up as a devout Jew and kept the law, kept the commandments, and all that jazz. And so he had his Jewish bona fides big time. But he was also a Gentile as well. He was born in Tarsus and was recognized as a Roman citizen. That will come in handy a little bit later on, as we'll see. Again, most of you know about Saul's conversion. It came on the road to Damascus when we're told that Saul was on his way to, what else? Persecute some more Christians. And he evidently had quite the vision on the road to Damascus. It's been depicted in cinema many, many times, and this is just one of them.
Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?
Who art thou, Lord?
I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks.
Lord, what wilt thou have me to do?
Arise, and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do.
And of course, as a result, when the very phrase "road to Damascus experience" even today means somebody having a very big, obvious epiphany, where a truth makes themselves known to them in a very, very clear way. Everyone, matter of fact, you hear people talk about, well, if God gave me a road to Damascus experience, maybe I would do better. Well, I got news for you. Saul, was the only one in the Bible who had a road to Damascus experience. Moses was the only one who had a burning bush. Everybody's experience and interaction with God is a little different. No two are alike. But anyway, road to Damascus has come to mean something very obvious, very powerful, very in your face. Now again, Saul, who was very well known to the early Christians. Matter of fact, a Christian named Ananias was told by God to meet Saul in this house after Saul had gone blind from seeing the light, and it was Ananias' job to give Paul his sight back. And even then, Ananias said to God, "Are you sure this guy has done an awful lot of bad to people like me?" And God said, "Do it." And to his credit, he said, "Okay." And of course, he did it. And from what we know about Saul, he went and lived back at his hometown of Tarsus for a while. Again, you can understand why the early Christians would be hesitant to embrace him. This is like if you play soccer, if you were playing up against a very good team and one guy was just killing you in the first half, and all of a sudden you came out for the second half and he suited up and playing on your team, your first reaction would be suspicious. What are you doing? Are you for real? He would have to kind of prove himself to you before you gave him your trust. And even though Christians' primary trust is placed in God, when it came to this, Paul was a hard sell at first because of his very, very well-earned reputation beforehand. But the Lord had bigger plans. He sent a man by the name of Barnabas to look after Paul. We're told in Acts 11, Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul. Again, Saul had been living at his house kind of on his own for over a year, I believe. Barnabas found him and brought him back to Antioch. Remember Antioch, the first church as such, the first place where Christians were called Christians? So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. So for about another year, Paul begins worshiping with these Christians, earning their trust, and learning more himself about what it means to be a Christian. It was from this church at Antioch that Barnabas and Saul were sent on a very short mission at first. Their job was to bring just some relief supplies to some people who were suffering. They ministered to the Lord, fasted, and the Holy Spirit was with them. We're told in Acts 13 again. Paul getting in close, learning more about Christianity, learning more about Christians, and learning more about his special ability to speak to people. Again, he was a devout Jew, but he was also a Gentile, and a very rare combination. And what we'll see God doing here is Paul becoming the primary means by which God is communicating with the Gentile population of this period. Peter is the one that speaks strongest to the Jews. Paul is the one that ministers most strongly to the Gentiles. And again, we've talked about the social pressures that were present in the early church. It was very, very important for Paul to begin to establish himself as a voice to preach Christianity, to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with those who were not raised in the Jewish tradition. This is a very, very important thing. It's after this that Saul begins to be called Paul. Now, again, why did this happen? There's a lot of theories. We're not told in the Bible, so anytime we're not told something in the Bible, we leave it up to us to try to figure it out. And, oh gosh, we get all kinds of theories. Bottom line, the Bible does not say why Saul began being called Paul. It may be that Saul was his Jewish name and Paul was his new name with a new life in Christ or whatever. Paul was his Roman name in Latin, as some of the Anyway, there was no big now you are Paul. It just happened. They started calling him Paul. Maybe it was a way he embraced to kind of leave his old identity as Saul behind. Anyway, from this point on, we began calling him Paul. And to answer the $64,000 question, nobody knows why people started calling him Paul. Anyway, we are told that Paul began missionary journeys. I'm going to show you some maps as we go along here. And keep in mind, it's very hard to translate distance and what it was like at this time. We live in a world where live conversations with people are just a couple of phone clicks away. These were arduous journeys. These were journeys over land and sea, with all the treacherousness of the sea. There was very little that was certain. You had a whole lot of excitement, possibly. But he traveled to cities all over Europe and Asia Minor, Turkey now, teaching and preaching. Again, 3 major journeys. The first one here, let's take a look again. In this one, now, and this map, you're seeing the first and second. Look at that little inner loop there. He went with Barnabas, again, his Christian mentor. They traveled to 9 different cities, covering about, here we go, 1,400 miles in 2 years. Wow, that's huge. 1,400 miles on ship and not even horseback. A lot of the times, evidently, they were just walking. So this was a whole lot of shoe leather. Again, because Paul was a Jew by birth and a respected Pharisee, he was allowed to speak in the synagogues. Again, this is important. Synagogues were Jewish places of worship. They were still scattered across Europe and Asia Minor. Not common, but they were there. And they were able to use Paul's status as a Jew by birth, but he was also a Roman citizen. Again, it's complicated, but Paul was uniquely positioned to reach people that the first Christians otherwise probably could not. He had connections. He had, may as well say it, he had certain privileges by his birth and by other circumstances. And again, God saw an opportunity here and used it to great effect. We hear about Paul and Barnabas doing miracles. Again, we talked about the miracle of the leper at the beautiful gate last week. Miracles were not all the apostles did. It was not even the primary thing the apostles did. But they did them from time to time to remind people that, yes, we are dealing with the power of an omnipotent God. Jesus did not exclusively do miracles. He did not even primarily do miracles. But he did them from time to time, just to remind you, and those who were listening to him, that this is the kind of power we're talking about here. We're told Paul and Barnabas healed a crippled person in Lystra. Some were convinced that Paul and Barnabas were the Greek gods Zeus and Hermes when they were in Macedonia, modern-day Greece, and tried to offer them sacrifices. Now, as you can understand, the Jews that they ran across were less than enthusiastic in quite a few cases. Yeah, they made some Jewish converts, obviously. But Paul survived several attempts on his life, evidently, and continued on with this first journey. Again, going back to the map here, circling back to the home base of Antioch. So remember, 1,400 miles in this first missionary journey. Well, Paul, about a year and a half later, went on a second missionary journey. Instead of 9 cities, he went to 12 cities. Instead of 1,400 miles, he doubled it up. He went 2,800 miles in a 2-year span. Now, this time, though, he traveled with Silas at the beginning and later Timothy. Paul and Barnabas went on separate missionary journeys this time. Paul continued his teaching in the synagogues and, again, performing the occasional miracle. He heals a slave girl from demonic possession. That's a good thing, except the slave girl's owner was making money off of her mental illness, apparently using her as sort of like a freak in a carnival show. The slave owners dragged Paul and Silas to the city judges and accused them of causing problems. Paul was beaten for healing the slave girl and thrown into prison. Well, thanks a lot. But while in prison, Paul ministers. In Acts 15, quote, "And at midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's bands were loosed." God used this miracle to convict a jailer of his sin of unbelief, and he became a Christian that very night. Again, Paul went through a lot of suffering. We're just scratching the surface on that. But remember I said he was a Roman citizen. And as a Roman citizen, he legally could not be punished without a trial. That gave him a very, very big advantage over other people. Not that it saved him from beatings, but again, he was a Roman citizen. And that's why we still study the government of Rome today, because the Athenians had a democracy a little bit before them, but the Roman Republic, later the Roman Empire, had the really the rudiments of what we now know as citizen rights, or what we consider to be natural rights. You cannot be punished without a trial, basically. But again, that only applied to Roman citizens. But he was a Roman citizen, so. After the jailbreak and after all that, Paul requested a trial, and the people of Philippi said, just leave, just go. And so he did, but he made his mark. Towards the end of that second journey, Paul made a very historic stop in the city of Athens. That was the jewel of ancient Greece, and even though it was no longer a military power at this time, it was still a very influential city. It was a port city. Right there on the Mediterranean, so you had a lot of people coming in and out of town all the time, transient population, and you had a whole lot of people from a whole lot of different places, and the Athenians, the people in Athens, were naturally curious and intellectual, and so they sort of almost embraced every belief system, every god. So if you walk down the streets of Athens, there were statues of different types of God from so many different religious backgrounds. Now, Paul, to his everlasting credit, did something I think was just a stroke of genius. Again, he's in Athens. Christians and Jews, particularly Jews at this point, were seen by Athenians as sort of backwards. Again, we've talked about how the Jews were viewed. Christians were probably even worse because they were, even newer and weirder as far as they were concerned. Paul ministered to the Athenians not by giving them a fire and brimstone speech saying, "No, you guys are doing it all wrong. You're going to hell. This is the way you're supposed to do it." He opened up by praising them, by praising their intellectual curiosity, by pointing out that they are an open-minded people who are willing to consider all kinds of truths. Then he said, what if? What if all these gods that we're looking at here are all the same one? What if all of these are manifestations of one almighty, all-powerful God? There were some who rejected that, but there were others who were curious. There were others who, much like me, stroked their beard hair on their chin and said, what if that's right? And so, by being somewhat flattering, Paul is able to plant the seeds of Christianity among one of the most influential populations in the Western world at that time. He appealed to the deep thinkers of Athens. Paul was able to give a good, emotional fire and brimstone type sermon, but he was also able to deal with those who thought rather than felt primarily, I should say. We are told at the close of his second journey, he went to the city of Corinth and stayed there almost a year. About half of his second missionary journey was him staying in Corinth. Made good friends with Aquila and Priscilla. They were tent makers and very, very wealthy, we're told. We're also told that they were absolutely indispensable to Paul in terms of not just keeping him, well fed, but also helping with the formation of the Corinthian church. I use Aquila and Priscilla as examples sometimes when some people cite Christianity as, anti-rich person or whatever. That's not necessarily true. God never said rich people are evil. Jesus never said that. He said it was a very complicating factor sometimes. But Aquila and Priscilla are just one of many examples of rich people using their wealth to do an awful lot of good to spread the ministry of Christ. And, of course, we know that Paul wrote 2 long letters to the Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, basically dealing with the problems at that church. You can feel Paul's affinity for those people. He lived there for a year. He knows these people well. And that emotion comes out in those letters. And thank God he wrote them, because, again, we are still studying them with a jeweler's glass in our eyes here 2,000 years later. Now, 3rd missionary journey. Hold your horses. He went around Europe and Asia Minor, covering about 5,000 miles in the next 10 years. Yeah, you'd think it would take a while to get 5,000 miles. Basically, for the next decade of his life, Paul was a traveling man. In Acts 19, quote, "Now God worked unusual miracles by the hands of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons were brought from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out of them. Paul raised a man from the dead who had fallen out of a window during a late-night sermon." So, again, in just the span of 2 chapters of the Bible, we're told about 10 years of Paul's life where he did an awful lot of ministry to most of the known world. He was thrown in prison again in Jerusalem, again, going back to the heart of Judaism, and preaching, and again getting the attention of the Jewish officials. Evidently, 40 Jews conspired together that they were going to kill Paul. This plot was discovered. A boy reported the murder plot to a Roman centurion. The centurion, again, Paul's a Roman citizen. He decided to, first off, sneak Paul out of Jerusalem at night and delivered him to the Roman governor in Caesarea. For about 2 years, Paul was sort of a house prisoner there, not able to leave, but still able to receive people. It was an unusual ministry, but he embraced it, and he was able to see a whole lot of people, and he still had a very good reputation. But the Jews persisted in trying to get Paul to stop preaching. Again, if you want to try to do it, they're doing it just like they did to Jesus, accuse him of breaking Roman law. Well, unlike Jesus, Paul can have a full trial. And in the year AD 60, we actually have records, hard records of this. Paul formally requests a trial in front of the emperor. The emperor's name was Nero. We're going to talk more about Nero next week. He had quite the reputation, too, and if you're a Christian, not a good one. Paul had to travel by ship to get there, of course, and some scholars are labeling the trip to Rome as his 4th missionary trip, but that's sort of an academic exercise. Well, Paul was shipwrecked on this rocky little island called Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean. Paul knew he was going to survive because he had been told by God he was going to bear witness in the heart of Rome, and he hadn't gotten to Rome yet. So he told all 276 people on board the ship, "Chill out, folks. I've already known, God's already told me I'm going to make it to Rome." Well, he didn't say anything about the other 276, but Paul was able to keep them confident, and sure enough, none of them died. It was a remarkable thing. For 3 months, they lived in Malta, and again, took advantage of that missionary opportunity to establish, what else, a church in the middle of what's now the nation of Malta. Turned into a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for ministry. The book of Acts closes with Paul finally getting to Rome. And he had the opportunity to preach with what the Bible called great boldness. He was also granted partial freedom. Again, still under mainly house arrest at the time. But we're told at the end of Acts, Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him. Kind of like in Caesarea. He was, instead of a missionary, he was, instead of going out to people, now people were coming to him, still spreading the word. Paul wrote most of his letters in that last 2 years of ministry. The 2 letters to the Corinthians, 2 to Thessalonica, the very famous letter to Timothy, to Titus. After those 2 years, we're less certain as to what happened to Paul. There's nothing in the Bible directly. It's believed that after all of his years of teachings, imprisonments, trials, and whatnot, Paul probably died a martyr's death under Nero. We'll learn in the next lesson more about Nero. But again, our focus on week 2 is Paul and the wonderful life he led and how absolutely crucial he was to the spread of Christianity. If not for Paul, who knows what happens? Maybe it all happens eventually, but it does not happen as quickly. One man's efforts primarily took Christianity geographically from this little outpost in the Mediterranean to the heart of Western civilization. Can't say enough good things about Paul. We'll talk Monday about some of the trials that Paul had and just how important all this was. Again, we're not going to get deep into philosophy, but we'll just take a look at this remarkable achievement that we have, spearheaded by this guy who was once the chief persecutor of Christians. I'll have a good day. We'll see you Monday.